we're all just humans at work. The team you're on, these are just the relationships. We're all on a leadership journey in different capacities in life. It all starts with that first step. It's a lot easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting.
I'm Ed Marsh, and I appreciate you joining me today for this episode of the Industrial Growth Insitute Podcast. I chat with guests about a lot of the mechanics of revenue growth, including hiring and managing great sales talent, how to build collaboration between marketing and sales. But of course, that's a relatively narrow segment of talent management, and obviously a resilient company that can scale to meet growing demand and deal with adversity and retain really strong talent requires a talent strategy. Building culture and collaboration and excellence across an organization doesn't just happen by accident. We know that from talking about it in terms of sales, but it's also true of the rest of the organization. So today I'm going to chat with Patrick Hayes, who knows how to drive that talent growth. You start by focusing on people, leading the team, and he does that by working with CEOs and particularly private equity teams and company leadership, as in his role as the founder of, I'm probably going to say it wrong, he can correct me on it later, Mukala Partners, where his goal is to shape teams that know how to create value. He didn't just fall into this. Patrick holds a bachelor's in economics and psychology from Amherst College. After Amherst, he spent 2 years in Zambia as a Peace Corps volunteer, and later he earned his MBA from the London Business School. In keeping of one of the recurring themes on this podcast, that NCAA athletes seem to achieve excellence in a variety of activities, I want to call out that while Patrick was a student at Amherst, he was elected captain of the varsity football and track teams. And then actually later he transitioned to a role helping to coach the football team. Before launching Mukala, Patrick was a leader in talent assessment, organizational design, and team effectiveness at Green Peak Partners and at Bridgewater Associates. And he hasn't let go of his fitness from his college athletic days. He now stays active, training for triathlons, and he's also coaching youth sports and, of course, trying to keep up with a family and growing kids. So that's a little bit about Patrick. We're going to learn a lot more about him. I look forward to that discussion today. So thank you for joining me, Patrick.
Ed, great to be here, and thanks for the kind words and the fun introduction. And it's always funny to hear yourself talked about that way. But, I'd say the thing that is fun for me too about this is that you and I just kind of found each other out in the world. And I think a big part of what has helped me in life and made life fun along the way is meeting new and interesting people. And I've tried really put a lot more effort into doing that over the last 6 months. And you're one of those people that I connected with through that process. And it's been fun getting to know you so far. And I'm excited to spend some time here today.
Good. So as we get started, I just want to jump in and remind everyone, help get the word out about amazing guests like Patrick. Hit the bell, like the episode, drop a comment, argue with what we're saying, agree with what we're saying, whatever comment you want to leave, maybe share the episode and certainly subscribe to it. So to your point, Patrick, we met actually because of a cartoon back in May, and you've been leaning into LinkedIn, sharing a type of content that I can't quite figure out how to name. It's kind of thought-provoking meme that's somewhere in between. You made a conscious decision to jump into LinkedIn, and what prompted that?
Yeah, it's there's a few things. One was if I started Mukala in 2019, and you nailed the pronunciation earlier, by the way. Thankfully, it's fairly phonetic. But Mukala means village in the tribal language I learned when I was in the Peace Corps. And when I was starting this business, for me, I chose that name because of this idea of it takes a village to get anything of meaning done, I think. And so we do that a lot in work. And then also for us, we're building our own village over here, the team at Mukala. But, we've grown about 20% every year based solely on inbound and referral. So we've done, great work for person A, and that's brought us to person B. And as the team and I came together this year, we thought about, well, how could we accelerate that? We want to keep that great referral business going, but we're very much, it's kind of, I joke, it's like age appropriate that we're just taking these baby steps into building a brand and any kind of marketing. We haven't had to do that thus far. And I'm also having a lot of fun with it. So when you ask the question, it's really been about what are the ways we can get the word about Mukala out And we're doing a couple things. One is we're doing more kind of classic outbound to clients and prospects. But the posting on LinkedIn, I worked with a great guy named Neil Bearden, who's super helpful as kind of a teacher on some of that work as well. And it's really been an effort to take the things we're doing on a day-to-day basis with teams, which, by the way, our work is like very human. People forget that. We're all people at work, and we're just writing these anecdotes about, hey, here's this crazy thing that happened. And I think the goal was put out something that's different than what else is out there. And I think there's a lot of kind of the same stuff, and there's some really interesting stuff. And I think the nice thing about LinkedIn, I'm noticing, is if you put stuff out that's different, it gets noticed. It doesn't always get noticed, but it does. And it leads me to people like you and others. And we've had some great success with that. And I think there's like this little repressed artist in me that also likes taking some time to step back and try and be creative in the writing of these things and be compelling. And it's still work in progress, but that's kind of what got us to doing it. And it's I got to come up with this week's post, so we'll see what that topic's about. It's always kind of hanging over my head, but I like it.
Do you keep a running list ahead of time so you've got a list you can pull from, or are you kind of nervous the day before? What am I going to think of this week?
It's funny. It's like I think I am definitely a wake up in the morning and see what comes to my mind kind of person in life. Generally, I'm working on being more planful. I have a list. I think the nice thing about what we do is we have this kind of ongoing contact with clients,
right?
And they welcome us into their world, whether it's working with an individual or, even more frequently working with a team. And there's always kind of something, there's always something that if you step back and you look at the calendar, you think like, that's kind of interesting. And I bet a bunch of people could relate to that. And it's been kind of fun to try and put the story out there. Less, of course we're doing it because we want to build a brand and we want to put that out into the world, but we want to attract the right clients. But it's also just like, I think if we can tell a story that people go like, oh yeah, like I had that or something like that. I think that's kind of fun too.
Yeah, of course, as you're talking about it, two things jump out at me. Number one, you're never talking about coaching or training or assessments, or you're not even talking about Mukala. You're talking about a situation.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you've alluded to that I'm seeing more and more is that the traditional approach to content, write a 1,000-word or 700-word blog post that, is very well thought out and articulates a position and describes the background and has headlines and bullets to make it easy for people to scan, is much, much, much less effective because people have less time to interrupt their time to consume that kind of content. And now it's really edutainment that can either be scrolled with some sort of potentially an arresting headline or hook or image or and or on LinkedIn where they scroll through and they kind of see something is, well, that's interesting. And then they dig deeper in this 0-click world, or it's content they can passively consume like video or like podcasts or things. So I think you've hit on the fact that you're telling stories and not talking about the company, maybe deliberately, maybe by chance, but that's a huge mistake many companies make, is just talking about what they do. And then you've also found a way to reach people how they're consuming content now. The cartoon that and actually, an interesting story, I didn't even see your post. Ben Tago, a friend of mine who I work with on various assessment kind of issues, saw it and said, hey, he's saying some of the same kinds of things you're saying. You two ought to connect. So it's even a further illustration of how that kind of viral effect of social media can work. But in that cartoon, you talked about a GE veteran named Trent, who was a proud New Yorker getting installed as a new director of sales at a company in Cleveland. And, it just kind of was pregnant with the friction and antipathy and resistance and kind of passive aggressive sort of resistance that you can just you just understand it reading that if you've been in business and worked with people at all. So you did a great job in what was maybe one or two sentences capturing so much of that.
Yeah, thanks for saying all that. And I love the story of it wasn't even you who saw it, because that's actually, it really does speak to the power of these things. And we have this recurring character, Trent from Long Island, and no disrespect to anyone named Trent out there, but it's kind of
or
of
anyone
funny,
from Long Island.
Exactly. And And we had a couple posts with him. We had, I love New York, but not that guy they sent from New York was one of the graphics that's a great example of like, it was just a sketch on my, iPad with the Apple Pen.
Right.
And I'm not a good artist, it was like that kind of thing. And then we had organ rejection was another version of that, where it's like, that's the post you're talking about. But, we see this all the time. Right. And it's not even necessarily wholly a knock on Trent. I think like people get really, enamored to their ways of doing things. And there's also a lot of pressure that a new leader has when they come into an organization to, set a new standard. And, everybody, the subset of folks we're working with which tend to be kind of C-suite level leaders in private equity backed businesses or senior investors in hedge funds. This is like a type A, hard charging, ambitious subset of humanity, right? And everybody, I think this is true of everybody, but in particular, that group really wants to come in and quickly have impact. And so people get, they know how to do things a certain way. They want to bring that to bear, but it's, if you move too fast, there's a reason why things were done the way they were done before. And there probably is a mandate for change, but it's about understanding what's going on before you make the change. And I don't know, it's funny. I don't know why this is coming to me, but I haven't thought of this story for years. I'm going to tell a little story right now. It's from my Peace Corps days. So what the biggest mistake arguably I've ever made in my entire life was I arrived in Zambia, and my responsibility was to be a health educator for this group of 10 villages that I lived in. And you went around to each community and you set up these trainings, and you would teach them safer behaviors as a means of preventative healthcare versus curative. So sleep under a net so you don't get malaria, feed your kids some protein so they don't get malnutrition, those kinds of things. And so I show up, guns blazing, I'm going to change the world. And there's this tribal language, Lunda, that I'm learning. And I'm thinking all the materials that Peace Corps had given me were in English. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to translate all these written materials into Lunda. And then I'm going to do this session with this village, and it's going to change the world. These people are going to be blown away because now they're going to be able to understand the content and blah, 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 blah. So you got to picture this. I'm in a mud hut. I have no electricity. I'm hunched over this table. I've got candlelight. And like, I don't know the language well enough to like really be able to. So I'm literally going like letter by letter. And I translate this 30-page flip chart. It must have taken me like, I'm not kidding when I say it took me like 2 or 3 weeks. It was back-breaking. My back hurt. And then I go to the first day of the training, and I put this thing up, and I'm in this little church, and I put this thing up, and there's just a bunch of confused faces looking at me. And I'm like, what is going on here? Like, what's the deal? And I get a few minutes into the training, and somebody raises their hand in the back, and they're like, what's on the flip chart? And I'm like, Lunda. It's your language. And they're like, Lunda's not a written language. So nobody there, even though they didn't know English, many of the people, some of them knew English, but many of them didn't know English. They never learned Lunda as a spoken language. They didn't know it as a written language. It's a classic example of, I guess I know why it came to mind when I'm talking about Trent, but you got to listen,
right?
And you got to pay attention to what's happening in the environment you're in, before you should have too firm of a point of view on what needs to change and what needs to happen.
And do you think it's before you have a firm point of view on what needs to change, or on how you can most effectively achieve that change?
That's a good question. I mean, it's probably both those things, because
you knew that there were certain things they could do to be more healthy that they should do. Exactly.
But what I needed to figure out was how to get that across to them.
Right.
Like I'd say that's my biggest, there's like the kind of young, ambitious 22-year-old Pat just trying to, get out there and get in a hurry and do something. And the flip chart is kind of it's funny because it's so bad example of really missing the calling there. But ultimately beyond that, it was really about figuring out how to convince them that this new way of operating actually would be better for them and better for their families and their kids and those kinds of things. And that's the real work. Because I think, Ed, your question is a good one, which is a lot of times Trent comes in, and Trent actually does have really, really good ideas about, we should do this a little bit differently, and we should tweak that, and we should cut this thing out, and we should focus more here. But if Trent doesn't understand why things are the way they are, and he doesn't
Right.
take the time to understand the personalities, he's never going to have a chance to bring them around to this new way of operating. And that is really certainly as a Peace Corps volunteer, that was my job, was to convince these people. It's a tough sell, but like, I know you've never boiled water before, but like, believe me, this can make a difference. I know that you use the mosquito nets to go fishing, but there's a couple problems with that. Pesticides on there in the river, but like, also that's, that really is the mandate. And I think people can lose. I know I've lost sight of that at times.
But the interesting thing about that story that jumps out at me is that you were able to recognize the positive intent, but the folly in your approach, as opposed to foisting the blame for the ineffectiveness onto the group. Well, what do you mean they can't read? I mean, how am I going to make any headway if they can't read? I mean, you said, okay, I had a good intent, but I went about it the wrong way. And I think a lot of people don't have that degree of introspection.
Yeah. And I thank you. And I think the other thing that was, I think I've been good at listening to people in a lot of situations. And I think this is one where, if I think about so where did we go from there? And this wasn't an idea that I came up with all on my own. I'd heard of somebody doing this, but I found this guy named Rhodes, and Rhodes was a villager who spoke great English and was like super motivated to help. And then what I did was I had Rhodes lead the trainings.
Right.
And I would sit off to the side and answer questions if I needed to, but he was more conversant. He was one of them. He could, like, they would get in these long back and forths in Lunda, and I like knew it well enough, but I sometimes wouldn't even totally know what they were talking about. But I knew that something was happening between them that literally was never going to happen between me and the audience.
Right.
Ever. Because I wasn't one of them. I didn't look like them. I didn't know the language well enough. I was kind of this weird, odd thing to them, and I didn't know their customs and their ways. And so I think I was pretty quick to recognize that I was actually not, even though it was kind of, I was brought there to facilitate this change. I was not the best vehicle to actually make that change happen. And I think the other thing that I would apply, this is actually a really fun conversation because I haven't thought about mapping this story enough to the work we do. And now we'll do more of that, I guess, but is to have to recruit. I don't think this is a totally novel idea, but you got to recruit your ambassadors who are going to be on board with, who are the people who have, big networks at work and people look to, and who are excited about the future that you're painting, who you can have on your team to help drive the change, especially further down in the organization. And we've seen, a number of great leaders really struggle with driving change, not just down through their team, if they don't have their team fully bought in, because it kind of just all stops there.
Well, let me introduce another analogy that comes to me as you're talking, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm interested in what you think about it. It sounds to me like the guy who kind of took charge was a leader, and you were a manager. Now, certainly you've got a lot of leadership capability you honed in athletics and everything else, and then running a business. But in that situation, you were a manager, whereas he was a leader. And I think when you talk about organizations where the quote unquote leaders struggle, often in my experience, the fundamental problem is that they're not leaders, they're managers. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it gets into the distinction of what those things are. So maybe say a bit more like, what do you mean by manager? What do you mean by leader?
So a manager is somebody that kind of understands the steps and can sequence them and can look at resource requirements and assign responsibilities. A leader is somebody who kind of pulls folks to accomplish those by virtue of the example they set, the way they do the work themselves, the way they inspire others around them, the way they lift people up and hold people accountable. So one is kind of an administrative thing, and the other is maybe it's you could say style or personality sort of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like the way you're juxtaposing those two things, and they're obviously both really important for an executive. You kind of, as you describe those two aspects of it, I think a really successful executive is going to bring both of those things to bear. And in the way you're describing it, I'd say, yes, the person who struggles to bring the team underneath them, convince them, bring them along, assuming they're we call them like winnable minds.
Sure.
Like some people just aren't going to be, and recognizing that and taking the appropriate action is actually incredibly important. And I don't know that I would have put it in these words, but when I found myself in that situation, what I've come back to a lot with clients is coaching the client to focus more on the people, and it's a very kind of human thing you're describing. What are going back to the stuff we post on LinkedIn? What are the stories or story that these people need to hear that they can then re-articulate, tell further down in the organization, that's really going to speak to like their heart and their stomach more than their head.
Right.
And it also reminds me, there's this great book called Switch by Dan and Chip Heath out of Stanford. And they talk about change. And there's this idea of this metaphor of the elephant, the rider, and the path. And these three components to affecting change in the way people behave or think about things. And the path is like the analogy they use is when governments wanted to stop people from smoking, the path would be like, okay, so, or reduce how many people smoke. Okay, so the path would be, you have to be 18 to buy the cigarettes. The elephant is emotion, and the rider is your brain and like the logic. And so for years they were trying to slow down smoking rates by putting out statistics like, hey, X number of people get cancer, blah, blah, blah. And it did nothing. But then in the UK, they started putting charred lungs on cigarette packs, and that actually like had a huge impact. So the other thing that comes to mind here is the stories and are you appealing to the elephant? Are you appealing to and to me that is in line with your definition of leadership. And then the other thing is, and it's connected to this, is the great leaders I think have, really, you have to have that vision.
Sure.
Like, it can't just be this. It can't just be more of the same or kind of hodgepodge. It has to be this clear, crisp thing that like sings to people.
Right.
And we end up providing some sort of feedback that sounds something like, people want more communication from you, or they're confused around what's happening a lot. And almost every time we give that feedback,
communication's a consistent problem, you mean?
Right? Almost every time we give that feedback, the leader is like, I couldn't possibly say this more. We get that, like, I don't know how they don't get it. And there's a bunch of research on this. Like, if it's clear in your head, you end up like not saying, you need to say it. And then what's that mantra? You tell them, and then you tell them, you're telling them, and then you tell them again. And it's like, it's almost, I think it's exhausting to some people. But I think it's just the reality of working with humans.
Right. All right, so let's get something out of the way up front. You do a lot of your work with private equity, and I'm interested to hear, I think of that as being very numbers and kind of cold, hard calculating. You're talking about stories and people and hearts and stomachs, so it's an interesting angle. But a lot of your work is during due diligence and then during integration of organizations. So some folks listening, a lot of privately held private manufacturers that are family owned, not private equity owned, they may think to themselves, well, that's not us. We're just kind of a regular family owned industrial manufacturing firm. Our culture is our family values. So help us understand, as we launch into some deeper stuff on this, how your work is still relevant, even if it's not kind of the cold calculating investor, but a traditional family owned business.
Well, I think we work with private equity in a couple contexts. One is, as you described, during due diligence, when they want to better understand the leadership teams that they're going to be working with. And if you look at the background of your average private equity investor, it's like fancy undergrad, investment banking, PE firm, fancy business school, and then back to private equity. And that's a gross generalization, but it's fairly true. And they're kind of nowhere on that journey is the opportunity for them to really learn about people and kind of operational teams. And so I think that a lot of the work we end up doing for private equity, I think about it as filling a little bit of a gap in their swing. Like, they're really, really good, much better than we are at a whole bunch of things, especially as it relates to, the financial side,
right.
Getting clear on, here's how you think about value today and creating value over time, And here's how you think about driving the specific pieces of performance there. And they've gotten better. Our clients have gotten better at a lot of other things over time, but they're generally, and I think this is the arc of your question, they are very oriented around numbers. And I actually think that having clarity around, okay, here's where we are today from a financial metrics perspective, and here's where we want to be in 3 years and 5 years is really powerful. And a lot of businesses don't have that clarity. Right. And the right private equity investor, I think, for some businesses can help bring that clarity and also more ideas on, oh, here's what's possible. So I think that's the other thing. When you work with somebody who's done something a lot, if you work with an investor who's taken a lot of businesses from A to B, their sense of what's possible or feasible is going to be a lot more expansive than yours is if you've kind of just been in this one business.
Right.
Right. And so I think the value that they bring in creating that clarity and helping leaders think more expansively about what's possible is great. And I think a lot of times what gets lost is, okay, now we've got all these numbers we need to worry about. A lot of the people side, the leadership in the way you're describing, a lot of those things fall by the wayside, either in the way that the private equity investors are managing the company by virtue of their board seats, especially if they're control investors. But then I've also seen that roll downhill to the management team themselves, who now all of a sudden feel like, oh my gosh, we've got all this new pressure. All they're talking about is the numbers. Well, we need to be talking about the numbers. And then the magic that made Joe's Steel Shop so amazing and nobody left and all that stuff, like people that stuff, they end up forgetting it, not on purpose. And so when I think about the role we can play, there is a, here's what you should know about this group of people and how they're working together, which is very data driven and has a kind of analytical bent to it. But there's a whole nother side of it. And honestly, our favorite part of the work, as much as the private equity investors are oftentimes our first point of contact and the folks who invite us in, our clients very quickly become, and have over years consistently become, the leadership team at the business itself. And that's where I think we can play a little bit of this go-between role to say, look, I know that they've now come in and said that that's the number you have to hit. And I know, I think I know how that feels for you, but we should talk more about that. But how do we want to make sure we don't lose sight of the greatness that's here while we're trying to take this business in a new direction? Because that's almost always going to be the situation. An investor's going to come in, and if the business has gone from A to B, they want to put it on a B to C. They want to put it on a different trajectory. And so that's going to necessitate some change. And then, by the way, it's probably going to involve some changes in leadership. And so how can we help those new leaders do the exact thing, like not show up with the flip chart in Lunda, right? Like, what can we do to get them to not do that and not be received as doing that with the team that they're now managing? And so that's a lot of, it's still kind of high level conceptual, but that's a lot of how I think about our role.
But is there any reason that a family-owned company can't go through the same process on their own without the impetus being an investment?
I don't think so. Yeah. I don't see any reason why that has to be a outside capital situation. Even on a micro level, like there's just ways to bring more planning and goal. We've done it. I have a small team. I have 2 employees. There's 3 of us, and we read the Traction book, if anyone's heard of that, about the entrepreneurial operating system, EOS. We have implemented that over the past 2 quarters. We've now fully implemented, which is it's transformed the way we go about running even this small little business. And so I think that's an example of the kind of thing that outside capital can bring into an organization. Mm-hmm. But does it have to come through outside capital? Absolutely not. It's really just a decision around like what kind of, what are you trying to do?
Or how big your thinking is going to be, like you said earlier.
Yes, and what are you trying to do, and then what tools do you want to bring to bear to do it?
So backing up, why Zambia?
So when you apply to the Peace Corps, you can choose a region of the world.
Okay,
and Africa, which is a pretty big place, was one of. I chose to. They said you can have a first choice and you can have a second choice. And my second choice was the Pacific. I thought like being dropped off on an island with a satellite phone would be pretty radical. But I really did. I was very enamored by Africa. My parents had actually spent time my mother was a Peace Corps volunteer, and my dad, who's Irish, really Irish, not like we talk about it here. He's from Ireland. He was in what's called the VSO, which is the British and Irish equivalent of the Peace Corps. And they met in West Africa in Sierra Leone in 1974. And they were there 1974 to 1976. And so I grew up in a house where they talked a lot about that. And of course, it wasn't, we had slideshows. They had slides on the little, and we project them up on the wall. And I just always thought that was incredibly interesting. And then 2004 to 2006, I went 30 years later, I went to Zambia.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you had a very structured, I would assume a very structured view of leadership and talent from football and from being a captain and then from formal psychology studies. And then you had this very different cultural experience. Certainly you were open to it by virtue of these family conversations and the way you were raised. But is there a contrast there or a combination that has informed your view on talent that's different than if you hadn't had that Peace Corps experience?
Yeah, it's almost a hard question to answer in the sense that I can't imagine who I would be had I not done this 2 years, and I'm probably similar for you in your military experience. And, for me, when I was coming out of school, it was either the military or the Peace Corps, which sound very different to people. But for me, they were very similar. There's a service component. The word adventure has always really had kind of a zing and an attraction to me and a challenge. And so, it's informed so much about the way I approach my life, my relationships, how I build my business. Obviously, it's the name, which is on the door, so to speak. I think the point we talked about earlier around let me answer the question this way. The way I showed up as a leader on the sports teams I was on. I was captain of every team I was on through high school and college.
Wow.
And I don't think I was ever the best player. And I attribute that to probably there's a few things. I worked really hard. I led from the front, but I think I was a real kind of force for cohesion. I brought people together. I think the leading from the front thing was a big thing for me in athletics that, no one was going to outwork me.
Right.
And I was going to show up at practice every day and buckle my chin strap up and we're going to get after it. And that's just the way it was going to be. And I think people will respond to that because it's not easy to do that. I would own that it's still a journey for me as I transition from being like in my business, it was just me for 3 years. I was the guy doing everything. And now I'm transitioning. I need to stop being the guy who does everything. Right. And so, as much as you asked the question about the Peace Corps, and I think I started to do it when I brought Rhodes into the mix, it's a little bit of like, how can I get out of the way?
So I think many people are naturally managers and struggle to be leaders. It sounds like you're naturally a leader and your struggle is to become more of a manager.
That's probably right. That's probably right.
You came back from Zambia. You jumped into Fidelity as an equity trader. Did you do that knowing it was a stop on your way to an MBA, or were you thinking that might be your career?
Yeah, I came home and I hadn't thought about the next step at all, which I would say is also very classic me. It's kind of like, okay, here I am. And I actually, before equity trading, I was doing my requisite return from the Peace Corps couch surfing tour. So visiting my friends all over and catching up with them on what they'd been doing for the last 2.5 years. And because I hadn't been home in that whole time. And one of the stops was out in Amherst where I went to school to visit the coaches. And I loved them as a player and I wanted to see them. And I went there and then, a month later or so, I think I was in Long Island with my buddy, Pat Welch, and the head coach called me and said,
Trent there?
What's that?
Was Trent there?
Trent was there. He was junior guy at the time. The problems hadn't started yet. And that's really funny. And the head coach called me and said, we got an opening. Would you come back and coach? And I was like, this is perfect. It's a familiar place, familiar thing. And so I went back and I coached for a year, and that was kind of the year getting my feet set and, getting used to running water and electricity again. It was a really hard year, but a really great year and a great place. And I owe so much to EJ Mills. He's still the head coach there. He's done a great job. And I was lucky to have him as a coach and call him a friend now. And then I went to Fidelity from there. And I knew, I think I always loved people, teams. always had an interest in business, didn't really know like how I would apply that. And so business school was definitely something I'd thought about, although I remember getting out of undergrad and saying like, there's no way I'm ever going back to school again. And then of course I did. And I went to LBS, but yeah, the equity trading was great. It was as work environments go, I would argue one of the favorites I've ever had. I mean, you know, it was classic. Like you're on a floor, you're on your feet, you're yelling across the floor. It was intense, but it was also, I thought it was a lot of fun. It was very team oriented. You never knew what any day was going to bring. And it got me, you know, it really put me on the path to the good first step to get me going towards business school. And then I think on the path I'm on now.
So you describe what you do, if I read it correctly, as organizational talent. Help me understand the difference between that and what we might call HR.
Yeah, so I think of our role, first of all, we're a third party, we're not internal. And I think there's all kinds of things that go along with that. Our greatest successes, by the way, are when we have strong internal partnership. As an advisor, there's all kinds of things you can do as it relates to the types of information I think you can get from people who might be a little more comfortable telling you because you're not their boss, or, you know, they're less worried about that. I think as an outside advisor, you also have the advantage of you see a lot of organizations, and so you're not overly grounded in the status quo of whatever this one particular place is. So I'd say the first thing I'd say is strong partnerships with an HR leader or a CEO are really, really important for us. I think about our role as being, you know, there's really three things we do. We help to assess leadership talent. And there's two sides of the coin. There's leadership assessment and leadership development. They go hand in hand. And we
also
are
coaching, right?
Yes. And fundamentally, you know, in our bones, Mukala is a leadership development business. We are about helping people and teams be more effective.
Okay.
Now, one of the things we do in service of that is we do assessments, because any developmental exercise benefits from hey, here's where we're at right now. You as an individual, Ed, here are the things you're doing really well. Here are the things you're not doing as well. What do you think about that? Let's talk about that. That then informs where we try to improve you. We do the same thing with teams. And so our business is really around helping investors better understand management teams that they're working with. The second leg of the stool is we call them team development programs. We did not get creative with the naming there. It's how do you help teams become more effective? Small team dysfunction is everywhere. We have programs we run teams through that, you know, help them identify the obstacles to their success and better understand themselves, better understand their colleagues. And as we mentioned earlier, communication is almost always one of the challenges for teams. Relationship issues is another big one. And then we do a lot of individual development as well. So 360 feedback review programs and executive coaching one-on-one. And that all kind of, again, nests into this idea of how do you develop individuals and teams? How do you help them be more effective at work? And so HR is a big area that encompasses a number of things that include some of the stuff we do, but also a whole bunch of other stuff that we don't do. And I'd say the organizations we work with the best they oftentimes have some resources that might do some of the work we do, but oftentimes they're smaller and they might not have the huge learning and development organizations that a huge company would.
All right. So then looking at some of the companies you work for, one that jumps out at me and ties in with some of what you're talking about is Bridgewater Associates. I know when I read Dalio's book, Principles, I remember the part in there where he talked about the insights that they got from using assessments and how they use it to build teams, and the way, I think, I haven't gone back and read it in a while, but almost like creating baseball cards for each person so that they can hand them when they go into a meeting and you know immediately who you're talking to and how they absorb information. Did that culture of kind of rigor in understanding and talent and building complementary teams, did that contribute to the model that you have now?
I would not be where I am today if not for my time at Bridgewater. It's a truly unique place, and I sum that environment up as kind of like do hard things. Hold a high standard and just be real with one another. And I honestly think the world would be a better place if more people kind of prescribe to those ideals. At 1,500 people, which is what it was when I ended up leaving, at times it became a bit cold and impersonal, which was my challenge with it as somebody who's so kind of effusive and positive and build people up, you know. But the idea of, I think what Bridgewater, from my perspective, has done incredibly well on the investment side is they've really understood how the global economic machine works. And then they make investment decisions based on that fundamental understanding. And there was a pursuit while I was there, and I'm sure it's ongoing, to do the same thing with people, which is let's really understand how people work. And Ray Dalio used to talk about, Lego blocks. Like people are a combination of these different. Here's what your conceptual thinking is, and all these things. And I don't think it's a perfect metaphor or analogy, but there's something to that. And so we would talk a lot. I did internal talent assessment and development work for them. I did some recruiting work for them as well. And it was a great place to cut my teeth on talent because they were so thoughtful in the way that they approached people and talent, and understand they were called baseball cards. And it was an aggregate of all the ratings you'd ever received. You could see who gave you what rating. They could see who so we'd be in a meeting together. You and I would be giving each other pieces of feedback. You might give me a big thumbs down on something, and I could see that, and everybody could see that. So everything was out in the open, which was as crazy as it sounds. But what it did help do is, I think, and it's on its best days and with the right people, it can really help. It can really help individuals develop more self-awareness, and then teams be more thoughtful in how they think about assembling and what capabilities they have and what capabilities they need. And a lot of what we do, the data we use in our work is really comes from two sources. It comes from interviews that we'll do with people, and we'll get different kinds of data. We'll get self-reported data, we'll get 360 feedback, we'll get organizational data. But then we'll also use personality survey tools. The one we use the most is the Hogan. There are many of them out there, but that we're doing a similar thing to what I'm describing at Bridgewater, where what we're trying to do is really help each individual on the team, and also us in our position, but more important, help each individual on the team understand what they're like.
Right.
And most people come into this process or come into that conversation with some sense. And there's a spectrum here, right? Some people are not that self-aware. Some people are hugely self-aware because they've done the work. But most people, the average person comes in, this is kind of what I do well at that. But there's usually some surprises or insights that come through, whether it's their pre-work conversations with us or when we get them in a team session and they're getting live feedback from their colleagues. It's like, wow, I had no idea that thing that I'm doing is driving them that crazy. Like that kind of thing. And that all gets into, what do you like? What's it like for people to work with you? And so the foundation of our team development programs in particular are very much nested they're grounded in a lot of the stuff that I learned at Bridgewater.
So you talked about transparency. I know Dalio talked in his book about radical transparency. I know one of Mukala's core principles is transparency. Yep. I assume there's a tie-in there. Certainly that can bruise some feelings, but if you get all of the political crap out of the way, that feels like it's hugely powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're definitely connecting. It's no coincidence that that's part of our culture and a really important part of it. And it's not always easy, I think, is part of what you're saying too. In fact, a lot of times it's hard, but there's very little to gain, in my experience, from obfuscating what you're feeling or what you think about a particular situation. Generally speaking, it's better to air it out. And I think there's there's so much good that comes from that. There's the politics piece you talk about. We were just doing a session yesterday with the team here at Mukala, and I was saying one of my favorite things about the team is there's just there's no bullshit. It's just like we know each other and we just get the work done, and there's none of that. And a part of that's we're small, but I think it's also kind of the contract we have with one another.
Sure.
But also, the challenge with not being transparent beyond the fact that like you're running around with all these ideas about other people and what's happening, and it can be frustrating, and there's all that side of it. But also, you're wrong a lot. And you don't know that until you put your idea out there and someone goes like, no. How about this? And then you're, oh man. And so I think for me, there were a number of things about Bridgewater I carried with me, but I think as I experienced that there and then in life, as I started to, I think I've always been a relatively transparent person, but then you see how how fallible you are. And then you're like, well, I could keep walking around with a bunch of wrong ideas in my head, or I could have the courage to put it out there, and I'm going to learn faster.
Right. So it sounds like you're talking about, let me say it differently. I think a lot of companies hire people based on technical skills. They define a role. They think they understand the skills that are required to do it. They look for somebody that has those. And then, maybe there's kind of a head nod toward cultural fit and some of the other stuff. Sounds like you're talking about kind of turning it around. Certainly nobody can be deficient in technical skills. They need to be excellent there, but that's table stakes. And we need great people that fit the team first. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think from my, we spend most of our time kind of C-suite and the level below. And so top of the house, and I'm not saying these things aren't true for the whole organization, but really understanding what a person's like and what motivates them. What are they afraid of? What are they after? That kind of information is, those things are going to have a disproportionate impact on how they show up on your team.
Right.
And, I was thinking about it on my run this morning about how important it is for us right now to hire people at Mukala who are learning Agile, because this thing is changing all the time.
Is that the same as growth mindset, or is it different?
Yeah. Say the same thing. Like people who are great learners, just to put it in plain terms, like you try something, maybe you get it wrong, but you get it right the next time. Right. Or, hey, I know you've always done this thing that way. We're going to try it this way this time. And we know it's going to be, because there's a bunch that goes into this, by the way. It's an attitude as much as it is an aptitude. Right. It's going to probably be a little bumpy when we do it this new way, but we're going to try it because we think if we can do that, then we'll get to this next thing. And so I think where I'm going in a meandering way here with this, I think for teams to really understand, okay, what are those things for your team? We have a massive change mandate here at Mukala, just given what we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow this business and innovate in our space that's dying for innovation. So we know that's front and center for us. That won't always be the case, but that gets away from, yes, I think most people look at skills and they overweight relevant experience. And if you don't have those things, by the way, that's a problem. Sure. Right. So I'm not saying don't worry about that at all. But I think that can't be your only filter. And the problem is with a lot of that stuff is that it's easy to misinterpret or assume that someone has skills that they don't. Right. Or that, because they did this thing in that context, that they can come and do it in your context, when there's actually I have a really great mentor, Jeff Hunter, who talks about people are actually just good at the context when they are good at the job. And so what is your context, and how does that context map to the context they've been successful or not successful in before?
I think about that so often in terms of NFL coaches, where you see Pete Carroll, failed with the Patriots, but he'd been successful in college football, and then society changed, and then he had a good run in pro football. I think about Bill Belichick and how he was the GOAT in a certain, era with a certain ethos, and then society changed, and I think he didn't. And, does he know the game really well? Yes. And I'm not a student of it, and I may be completely wrong, but my sense is that people are excellent in a context and not just excellent in the abstract.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's even as we're talking about it now, it's kind of, it's a little more ethereal. It requires more work than they're going to do this rote task, and therefore we're going to look for them. And those things, again, are important, but it's that next level of really understanding what is the person like. And then how are they, our work with the teams is how did all these people are complicated. And then it's multivariable math when you bring 5 or 10 of them together, and how are they all going to interact?
So when I took the Hogan, I think I broke it. When we're done recording, I'll show you mine. Maybe a case study for you, but probably the reason I work alone. But why is that your go-to tool? What do you like about it?
So what we like about the Hogan is it is really, it's kind of the people geeks tool. And a lot of these tools that are, I think, very useful are they're reduced down to, maybe 4 dimensions. And I think the use case for them is if you're going to roll that out across an entire organization, and you want kind of like the lay person to get savvy enough that they start thinking about it. Like you hear, I've heard a number of folks talk about, we use DISC, and DISC can be a great tool. This is not to besmirch the DISC at all, but we use DISC because people can understand it quickly. And then if you're a salesperson, you start to think of is this a high D person I'm dealing with or not? And so I think the other tools are better because for those kinds of use cases, because they're a little simpler and easier to understand.
Right.
The Hogan has many, many, many dimensions, and it has 3 different surveys. What do you like under normal everyday circumstances? What do you like under stress? And then what are your core motivators? Basically, are the 3. It's called the MVPI, motives, values, and index. And so it's like those 3 outputs are actually quite interesting for us. So if we're going to spend a little bit more time with people, we like to use the tool for that reason, because it gives us that more nuanced insight, and we've done it enough that now it's kind of like we know it really well. And then, as I understand it, the validation behind it is incredibly powerful. So what their outputs are saying, based on the work that they've done, are actually representative of what the people are like.
All right, so I'm going to maybe touch a third rail here, with the caveat that I'm early Gen X, and one of my formative professional experiences was as an infantry officer. So kind of understand that's the way I'm coming at this. But I've been observing what I believe lately, maybe over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, is to be a really shocking decline in accountability across all levels of organizations. Do you see that?
I mean, I'm trying to think if it's worse now than it was when I, let's say I started at Bridgewater in 2012. Is it worse now than it was? I mean, the problem is I was in Bridgewater, which was high accountability.
Right.
So, it's hard to think through, is it apples to apples?
Well, I mean, if you've got to stop and think about it, I'd say that's encouraging, because it seems to me to be so clear. Maybe I'm just really biased towards seeing the examples of lack of accountability.
Here's the thing with accountability for me is, for most people, holding their direct reports accountable, having the difficult performance conversation, exiting somebody from the organization, these are really hard things.
Sure.
And if they weren't, if they were all really easy, there'd be a different conversation we'd have. So I think it's a place we see a lot of folks struggle, and I don't think that's a surprise, just given the fact that humans are kind of tribal beings, and in our relationships and harmony are really, really important. I do think that I have. While we're on third rail topics, we might as well. I think I have a lot of misgivings about remote work, and maybe that gets into some of what you're talking about. And and for me, I'll use if you and I had worked together for 5 years and then COVID happens and we go remote, we're fine, because we've got 5 years of history. We're advanced enough in our ages that these aren't like our early career times. And so we're good. We can self-manage at home. I have a pit in my stomach for the generation of people whose first 5 years at work, are at home in an apartment staring at a screen like this.
Right.
Because I don't know how you learn. So when that's the place, actually, your accountability question probably takes me with the most conviction, is I'm deeply concerned about how are those people actually going to get the skills that are going to help them really advance and drive organizations forward. And I really believe that the early, mid, late 20s folks who right now you're going to an office and you live with 3 roommates and they're at home, I promise you that in 5 years from now and 10 years from now, you are going to be running circles around them in whatever way matters to you, because you will have learned to a degree that I just don't think it's possible for them to learn. And that, I guess, goes back to maybe partly an accountability thing.
But a lot of that must also be because, as you're talking, I gather you don't see work as a series of tasks. You see work as a product of a team coming together around a set of goals, kind of a 1 + 1 = 3, as opposed to, I'm crossing things off my list. And I don't think you can build a team remotely.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people who take the other side of that. It's funny because I'm with you, and I look at a lot of these, it's just become more normal where you have these distributed C-suite teams.
Mm-hmm.
And in my head, I'm like, I don't get it. I don't get, especially when half of them are new to the organization.
Right.
and we're going to get maybe you get together every month. That's kind of the best cadence. And I've seen some organizations do that. Now that's a lot because you're going to take 3 days, you're going to travel. People are coming from all over.
Right.
But I don't know. In this way, I feel like kind of old school where I want to be in the office. I want to be able to go grab the person. And they talk about the water cooler talk, but it's a real phenomenon. And then how do you hold accountability across that distance? I mean, that just to me it takes a thing that's hard to begin with and makes it that much harder.
Of course, a big piece of accountability where I think a lot fall down is accountability of themselves. You can't with moral authority and credibility hold somebody else accountable if you don't hold yourself accountable. Now, we all fail and we all, slip on days, and we got to be open and honest with ourselves and with others about that. But fundamentally, you have to hold yourself accountable. I mean, I've got this theory, if you will, that high-performing athletes and often military vets tend to be more comfortable holding themselves accountable. I understand. I mean, you do it. You're grounding out miles for triathlons. How do you hold yourself accountable in the days when you don't feel like dealing with the crap at work? It's not so exciting to grow when you've got the problems to scale, or when you got to go out and put in the miles. What do you do?
If I'm, I have two reactions. It's a great question. One is, at this point for me, it doesn't really feel like work.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people, my sister-in-law says to me all the time, she'll laugh. She'll laugh that I included this here, but it's like, she says, just do less, and it's kind of a funny thing because I don't think I'm doing that. I'm not like, oh man, I'm going to get up today, I'm going to do all these things. But I think at the end of every day, I've done a lot of things.
Right.
Because it's become normal for me. But I actually think that a lot of that goes back to, this has been an evolution that I'm gone through and I'm going through with my business too, is like, it's having a sense of what's important to you over the longer term, which then illuminates the path and the steps to get you there.
Right.
And so I have this, I mean, it's funny or whatever, but my goal is physically to be able to throw my grandchildren around in the pool the way I throw my kids around. So my kids right now are 10, 8, and 5. So I've got to stay like fit for decades,
right?
Not like 5 years. So pretty much everything I'm doing physically in some way, shape, or form is being passed through the lens of, is this going to increase, decrease, or kind of not have an impact on my ability to throw the grandkids around whenever they, I'm lucky enough to have them, hopefully, right? Like in 20 or 30 years when I'm in my 70s. So the clarity of that objective, and I've done work to kind of arrive at that as a goal, that actually then makes all the day-to-day stuff just feel like, well, this is just part of that plan. And I think the same thing has happened for me with my business, whereas I've thought more about, what do I want this thing to be beyond, I started this thing. It was, year one was, the goal was provide for my family.
Right.
Right. Like very simple, like just get as much work as you can, do it, do a great job and win repeat business and stand the damn thing up.
Right.
And that got it off the ground. But, as time has evolved and we've got more foundation now, and now we've got people and we're talking about growing more and all these things. Now it's like, well, what's the next horizon, which then will give me, I think, two things that are important to do the hard work. One is the motivation to do it, but two is the clarity around like, what is actually the right hard work? Because I think a lot of people get stuck. There's a motivation issue. We have motivation challenge in this country. People want shortcuts. I think that's it's an issue.
Right.
But in concert with that, I think we have a clarity of what you could actually do issue.
Right.
That is as important. And if you can work on closing the clarity of what to do issue for yourself or for other people, then I think you start to be an agent for more people doing more. And I think just this spiral up effect. I don't know if I'm making sense.
You are. It's reminding me, my dad was a pediatrician. He used to talk about the challenge of being a pediatrician before he had kids. And so it's got me wondering, as you're going through these growth experiences in your company, is that giving you another dimension of understanding as you work with the leadership teams of companies that are growing as well.
100%. And I was thinking about that on my run this morning too. Was like, wow, what a gift to be going through this now.
Right.
So now I'm an entrepreneur. That's different. I'm not just a consultant. I am now trying to grow a business, and
Sure.
I'm bumping my head into the wall and stubbing my toe and eating crow and all the things that go along with, I tried this and it didn't work and it doesn't feel good and I got to get up and I got to do it again and like all that. And so our advice now that we provide to our clients, we're now, over 5.5 years into Mukala, the advice that our team is offering to our clients and the lens through which we're passing what we're learning about their organizations is significantly better than it was before I had undergone this journey.
Sure.
And my thesis, and I think it's a good one, is that will only continue to happen because we'll hit the next horizon, the next one, and the next one, right?
A lot of that's your growth mindset too. I mean, there's great quotes, and I can't think of anybody to cite specifically, but along the lines of, if you're not embarrassed at the work that you were doing 5 years ago, you're not growing fast enough.
Yes. A guy I used to work with used to say, to be great, you need to endure not being great.
Right.
Oh, it's like that one was always stuck with me because it's so hard for me from an ego perspective.
Right.
To endure not being great. Like that is, it's a vulnerable thing to say, but it is a true thing. Like that it just hurts me. But that is the path.
All right. So that's an interesting segue. A lot of the companies you work with have a new owner. They've got a very clear 7-year runway in order to make changes. There's a new sheriff in town. I mean, you can work with them on how to soften it and all that kind of stuff. But a different situation, take the family-owned company where Gen 4 has been gradually getting groomed and suddenly kind of is the president, if not the majority owner. There's often a lot of celebration for the legacy, but also a lot of resistance because there's almost always some change. Do you work with folks in that kind of a situation as well?
We have worked with a handful of family-owned businesses. It's and I think there's a unique. I definitely wouldn't want to position us as an expert on this subset. We've got more experience with in other types of settings, but what we've found is it's a unique dynamic, and it needs a really thoughtful management. Mm-hmm. Without having any, I think, informed playbook on the specifics. In a few of the ones we worked with, I think what it's come down to ultimately, and this is a really hard decision, is it time for the family to step aside?
Right.
Having grown up in the business can be incredibly helpful in leading it. If you are at a real inflection point, you brought in new capital and they want to do meaningfully different things. Oftentimes the fastest and best way to do that is to bring in leadership who have done those things before, especially if they're a radical departure from what you've done up to this point. It's not to say, I mean, there are plenty of family businesses who've scaled through generations and
sure.
But I think many more who haven't.
You used a euphemism earlier about exiting somebody from the company. How quickly can you generally tell if somebody's just not going to be for the team?
Yeah, you mean like in general for a person?
Yeah, you go in,
like
you start working with a team, you run your assessments, you look at what's going on with the group. Can you tell almost right out of the gate this person just isn't going to make it, or is there do you have to work through some steps before you can reach that conclusion?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things that come to mind with that question. One is, so if we're coming in and we're starting from zero and we don't know anything about a team or the people or the organization, I think we would be arrogant and remiss to say that we could definitively say someone's a star and someone needs to go to, right out of the gate. There's too much that it takes a little bit of time to understand. Now I'll pair that with, I have yet to see someone fire someone too fast. And I've been around a lot of those decisions.
Right.
It almost always, you never want to do the always thing. it takes longer than it should.
Right.
And so if you're managing a team right now and things have not been going well, if you challenge yourself to write out all the people on your team and think through, okay, who's kind of like, who's above the bar and who's below the bar, just to make it really rough, you probably know.
Right.
And then there's probably a bunch of reasons why that person's still there. They were my college roommate, or it's my brother-in-law,
right.
or it's, you know what I mean? Or like, I just can't even think through, like, that would just be so, whatever, it would be so painful to do. So I always balance, from our perspective, what we want to do is we want to bring as much information as possible to a leadership team to help them make the most informed decisions possible. But our information is being layered on top of what they already know. And if that answers the question.
Yeah, it's a good answer. So I use assessments as well in my work with sales teams, and I've seen some really interesting research that shows that behavioral and personality assessments are only 20 and 22% predictively accurate, respectively, of sales success. Certainly an important tool in finding the right team match and good chemistry between reps and managers and all that kind of thing, but not for finding top performing salespeople. That's a common misconception that I run into. What are the misconceptions or misunderstandings that you encounter frequently when you talk about assessments with people?
Good question. And just on to jump on the personality assessment. So there's all these diagnostics, whether it's Hogan or these other tools out there. And I always say I have a conflicted relationship with these tools. On the one hand, I love more data. And that's what they are. They're more data. In case of a tool like Hogan and many others, they're kind of validated. There's a lot of research that goes behind these things. At the same time, they're all imperfect. And in most states, I think it's technically illegal to make hiring decisions based solely on tools like this. You have to have other components to an assessment process. And I actually think that's a really good thing, because I think we'd be remiss to base, big decisions like a hiring or a firing decision solely on somebody answering a personality survey.
Yeah, some of the tools actually call out that they're specifically not intended for pre-employment screening.
Mm-hmm. And I think in part for that reason, right? So like the way we use them is we use them in concert with the other data we're getting. We just call, their data, the data we get through the interviews, of which takes a few different forms I described earlier. What does someone say about themselves? What do their colleagues say about them? What do people say about the area of the organization that they're running? And we're looking for patterns across these things, right? And I think that's the way that, for us, that's the kind of best way to use them. I think misconceptions around assessment are, well, first of all, some of the audience that we deal with, there's like this, I don't know what you want to call it, like this crystal ball phenomenon. Well, could you just go spend like an hour with them and then tell us what to do? And it's kind of like, that's not how this works. Like we need, I'm not looking in a crystal ball. There's no voodoo here. Like we have a process. It gives us a bunch of data. We use that data to make decisions. So I think there's a misconception around like it's just as simple as, just go in the same room and there's like this osmosis thing that happens. And of course, there's pattern recognition, yada, yada, yada. But like really, that stuff to me doesn't mean anything if you can't kind of ground it in real information. So that would be one. I think the other is that I don't know if it's as much a misconception, but about assessments in particular, but I think a lot of people look at assessments and they think of the assessment as an end in and of itself. So we're going to do this assessment. It's going to tell us what to do. We're going to do it. And then that's kind of all that we're going to use it for. And one of the things I just organically started doing when I started Mukala, we would do these, it's just me at the time. I'm assessing teams for private equity. And I just started sharing that work back with the management team I had assessed. And I did that because I'm like a coach at heart and I wanted to, that's the fun part of the work for me, or the most fun part of the work. And what we found is that the assessment is more valuable to the management team than it was to the investors. They get more value out of it. Now we do all kinds of really fun stuff with it. And so it's less a misconception, or maybe it is a misconception, but I think we use the assessments and there is a purpose for them, but it's in service of this other thing.
Sure.
And you can apply all these things. You give everybody the personality survey. That's great. You have an understanding of, what's your population like, but Okay, now what are you going to do with that?
Right.
Because there's a huge opportunity to help each one of those people, and then the little subgroups of those people, and all this cool work you could do to help them be better because of this initial assessment. A lot of that stuff just doesn't happen.
Right. Do you ever work with boards or just executive management teams?
We work with boards as well, and we think of boards as it's a smaller part of our business. I think over time it should. I think it actually just should, not because I want it for the business opportunity. I think it should be a bigger part of our portfolio of work, because boards are just teams.
Yeah, and boards,
especially,
I don't know how a board can perform proper oversight if they don't understand the executive management team. Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not managing all of them. They're managing the CEO, but they can't have insight into the CEO's strengths and weaknesses if they can't understand the team, I would think.
I think that's a big part of it. I also think that the way I was interpreting the question too is like actually assessing with and working with a board.
Sure.
On how the board works.
Right.
And one of the, I'm going to keep pecking away at this one. One of my goals with some of our private equity clients is the same stuff we ask the management teams to do. Take the surveys, take part in this exercise where we share back what we're like with one another. I want them to do it with the team too.
I love that. Yep.
Right. So like, this is a new team, new investment. Like, let's all get around the table and do the thing, and not have like, oh yeah, you guys, the management team, are going to do that. We're not going to take part in that. I think that's a great way to humanize. It's like it would be a competitive advantage.
Sure. It also goes to the accountability. We're not going to ask somebody else to do something we're not willing to do ourselves. We want to grow ourselves just as we're expecting you to grow.
Yes.
So we danced around a little bit, but give us a really good and clear profile of what a good client is for your firm, in case anyone listening is interested in thinking they should give you a call.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, our audiences to date have been primarily mid-market private equity, lower middle market private equity, and then the businesses that they invest in, and working, as I described earlier, mostly with the C-suite teams, although sometimes the level below that. And so I think if you're an executive in a business like that, we'd be a great partner for you. Whether or not you'd want us to work with your private equity sponsor, we've worked with a number of private equity-backed businesses with no relationship with the sponsor. So I think that's a great context for us. The other is multi-manager hedge funds in particular. We've worked a lot with those types of organizations. It's a great model for us where we've got our methodology around team effectiveness that I think works really well for investment teams, where you have really successful, smart, kind of like craftspeople who are investors who are promoted into portfolio manager roles and now need to achieve results with and through others, and it's a totally different exercise to do that. And so that's been another great client base for us.
So I think certainly sponsors and operating partners are often part of this audience. I'm not sure about the hedge fund folks. I don't know how much we'll be able to drive traffic for you from that group, but we'll see.
All good.
So what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you'll see our website, www.mukalapartners.com. I am on LinkedIn. You can just search for me at Mukala Partners, and then we've got an info@mukalapartners.com email. If you want to reach out, please feel free to direct message me or reach out to the info email address. And we love having kind of where we started this conversation, Ed. I'd say I love having conversations with people who are thinking through these issues, and I view this as a long game. And so even if it's something that might not be a need right now, we're always eager to connect with new folks and hear what they're working on. And maybe that becomes something over time, and that's cool too.
And I'll drop your LinkedIn profile link in the show notes. I definitely recommend, like you said, where we started, people should follow you. I think you're a student of how to make it work. And so just watching you perfect your art is interesting, as well as your content is interesting as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ed.
What resources do you recommend that people turn to stay up to date on talent management best practices?
Well, for me, I spend a lot of time reading like personal development and kind of management and entrepreneurship books. And that's kind of and there's a lot of learnings. I'm reading 10X is Easier Than 2X right now, which is a great book. We obviously got a lot out of the Traction book. And these things aren't directly related to leadership per se, but they in the ways we've been discussing it, but I think there's a lot you can learn from that. My favorite podcasts are The Knowledge Project, Shane Parrish.
Right.
I like the Huberman Show as well, although I think I definitely, the one I listen to the most frequently is Shane's podcast. Those are the big things.
And you say read. Do you actually get a hard copy, or do you read Kindle or audiobook while you're running, or what?
Yeah, so I do some audiobooks. I do a mix. I do audiobooks. I read on a Kindle or my iPad, and then the podcast. Obviously, I do, and I kind of like get it done while I'm, if I'm traveling, that's a great way to fill the time, and also when I'm doing cardio.
Got it. All right, so wrap us up. Talent management could be, I would say, as important as financial management and engineering and organizational success. Often, I think it gets a short shrift. What do you hope everyone listening to this takes away from this conversation?
Well, one is we're all just humans at work. And, remember that the team you're on, these are just the relationships, and they need to be treated like any other relationship where you got to put something in to get something out. And so I think remember that it's a human at work. And then, the second thing to remember is that we're all on this, you mentioned earlier, this idea of the growth mindset, Ed, like we're all on this journey. We're all on a leadership journey in different capacities in life. Some people in business, some people as a parent, some, all these other places. And there's multiple journeys that we all go on at different phases in our life. And so I think just remembering that just because this stuff might feel out of reach or you don't really know what you're doing, it's kind of like it all starts with that first step. And so just figure out something you're going to do a little bit differently, whether it's something you heard here or something you read in the book or whatever, and just start trying to apply it. And one of my favorite quotes is, it's a lot easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. And so just find something and do it. And then, I think the snowball builds pretty quickly from there.
Right. Fabulous. Wonderful stuff. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, Patrick.
Thanks, Ed. It was a pleasure.
And everyone listening, you know the drill. Hit the bell, drop a comment, share this, tag Patrick on LinkedIn when you hear something interesting in this, and please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. Thanks for joining us for this episode.